Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Rose, and I'm the Chief Strategy Advisor for the Content Marketing Institute. And I'd like to tell you briefly about an updated idea that we're calling the 2020 Strategic Content Spectrum. And I know that's a mouthful of words, but what I'm hoping to do is impart an understanding of what content marketing, branded content, and native advertising are, as well as the differences between them, because they are such an important part of today's blended content mix. So to that end, we wanted to produce a video that helps stratify these approaches so that we understand them better. See, perhaps two of the most frequent questions I'm asked about a new content initiative is, how much of our brand should be in our content? And what should the distribution model look like? But maybe there's even a third question that's just as important, and that's, does it even matter what we call it? Well, maybe not. Certainly, as we've said before, in many ways, it really doesn't matter what we call any of these things as long as the activities are clear in the business and that they're a meaningful part of our integrated marketing mix. However, one of the observations that we've made is that when we do these things well, each of these practices can be optimized to address the different parts of the engagement journey. So then, answering the two common questions that I mentioned before aside, I think that understanding and being able to explain the differences between content marketing, branded content, and native advertising can accomplish a couple of things. One is understanding the difference helps us make a more solid business case for doing one over the other, especially if we're asking for budget or permission from a part of the organization that has a bias for one over the other. Now, given the natural tendency for different approaches to support different types of goals, number two is understanding how to best utilize each approach helps us to optimize our chance for success. For example, a branded content campaign that features the brand much more prominently may be much better at supporting a short-term need for a lift in brand loyalty. A content marketing initiative that is itself its own content brand may actually be more effective at driving awareness for an old, traditional brand, introducing a new, disruptive way of doing business. You see, just as there are different types of advertising content that support different business goals, brand advertising, direct response advertising as examples, so too can each of the content approaches better support different business goals that we may have. Put simply, knowing the difference between all of them can help us be more successful at doing any one of them. So where do we begin? Well, we start our definitions by looking at the two fundamental questions that I mentioned before. The first one is, of course, about our brand. How much of our existing brand should we include in our content? Now, this comes down to a spectrum and an axis, and we'll start at the left-hand side here with what we might call content as brand. Now, for content as brand, we look at content as a completely separate product, unbranded, and perhaps sometimes even completely disassociated from our products. Then at the right-hand side of the axis, on the other extreme, we have brand as content. This is where we're simply creating an extension of our existing product or brand and expressing it as content. So put simply, at one end of the spectrum, we don't mention our brand at all. And at the other end, the content is all about celebrating the brand. A good example of content as brand is Johnson & Johnson's use of BabyCenter.com. On BabyCenter.com, you'll find zero mention of J&J aside from the terms and conditions. It's a completely separate division of J&J. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because the business goals of J&J for BabyCenter.com is not to sell more product. I mean, of course, it is to sell more product, but its business goal for the content is to provide value through a wonderful media product that might engage more parents to use their tools and thus give them the ability to acquire data to understand how to reach them better. It's basically helping J&J be better marketers. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have brand as content. And a great example of this is Salesforce's Dreamforce conference. It's a wonderful example of extending the Salesforce brand to a media operation. In fact, what would Salesforce.com be if it were actually a media company? Well, the answer might be Dreamforce, where they are celebrating everything about Salesforce as a means of driving more loyalty, evangelism, and differentiation for a product. Okay, and that brings us to our second question, which is this. What distribution model should we utilize for our content? Now, our answer to this question is also a spectrum, and we can look at it as our y-axis. Now, it's our content, of course. It's always our content, no matter how we distribute it. But the question is, how are we getting it in front of an audience? On one end of the spectrum, we might utilize owned distribution channels for the content experience. On the other end of that spectrum, we might utilize a rented or partnered distribution model. Now here, it might be good to look at just beyond the money being exchanged or not, and rather look at it from a control perspective. To plot along this spectrum and determine rent versus own, we might simply ask, how much do we depend, paid or otherwise, on a third party to distribute and engage an audience with our content? These partnerships may come in the form of a free partnered relationship through social media, or even a distribution deal with publishers, or movie theaters, or television networks, or even feature film studios. The point is, we don't control how and where we reach that audience. So, using these two questions as the basis for our X and Y axes, we can begin to plot in a stratification for content marketing, branded content, entertainment, and native advertising. So, let's actually start with the foundation of content marketing. So for content marketing, we're going to stick with one of the definitions that we've used for years, and that speaks to the foundational aspect of everything we do as focusing on brand as media company idea, the owned distribution model, and the strategic business focus and purpose of engaging and building an audience. So our definition, content marketing is a strategic marketing approach focused on creating and distributing valuable, relevant, and consistent content to attract and retain a clearly defined audience, and ultimately to drive a profitable customer action. Thus, it sits here at the bottom spot as primarily focused on an owned distribution model and as a foundational effort to build addressable audiences through our content and platforms. That brings us to branded content. Now, in their book, The Definitive Guide to Strategic Content Marketing, authors Lazar Zamek and Justin Kirby point to a Branded Content Marketing Association definition that we believe is fairly complete. They say, branded content is content that is funded or at least endorsed by the legal owner of the brand, that promotes the owner's brand values and makes audiences choose to engage with the brand based on a pull logic due to its entertainment, information, and/or educational value. Now, while we quite like that definition, we might simplify it and again add a prelude to it to add dimension of business goals to it. So we might say branded content is a specific content creation tactic typically produced through a sponsored or paid partnership between the brand and the media, and encourages audiences to engage with the brand based on its entertainment, information, or educational value. So here it sits in the middle. It's not that branded content never uses an owned media strategy, and certainly there is overlap, but it is primarily distributed through a partnered or paid means as a campaign to drive brand awareness, conversion, or loyalty. And that brings us to native advertising. Now, of course, the classic word for native advertising was advertorial. This is where an advertisement in a newspaper or magazine would appear in the style of an editorial or objectively journalistic article. Now, with the rise in digital media, this idea has, of course, been expanded a bit. Jesper Larsen, the CEO of Native Advertising Institute, has a wonderful definition of the approach, and he says native advertising is paid advertising where the format of the content matches the form, feel, function, and quality of the content of the media on which it appears. Now, this definitely helps us understand where it sits on the y-axis, but what about the x-axis? What goals can it support? So from our perspective, we might add just a little bit of a short prelude to Jesper's definition to say native advertising is a paid third-party advertising format that supports either brand or direct response goals and is where the content matches the form, feel, function, and quality of the content of the media on which it appears. And this sits right here at the top. Whereas a purely third-party paid model, it is about depending on a third-party platform to deliver content that looks and feels like the destination publication. So there you have it, the three elements of these different content approaches. Now, of course, there are other terms we're not covering here. Branded entertainment, well, we might place that in the branded content category. There is brand journalism, and that might actually fall into the overlap of branded content and content marketing. There's also sponsored content, which we would place right in the overlap of branded content and native advertising. And of course, there's custom content, which is, as the name implies, custom created content. So basically, it could be considered an outsourced version of any of the three approaches. What we end up with here is a stacked spectrum of strategic content approaches for marketing and communication purposes. Now, we can add one more lens to this graph and start to see how we might start to identify some of the best practices to get to the answers of those two core questions that I asked in the beginning, and provide some clarity to which approach might be best in a given situation. So, typically, now, not always, we're aware that there are exceptions to this rule, but typically, what we can observe is that when we look at the spectrum, we can align our efforts across the x-axis, across the customer journey. So now some of you may be aware of our masterclass and where we talk to the idea of the subscribe, win, and grow idea of content in business. See, it starts with our audience journey, this audience engagement journey, and this infinity loop journey that is relatively famous at this point, and a typical journey we might see of choosing an approach or a solution. They start by looking to see the discovery that this approach exists. Then they learn more about that product or service, and then they might try it or demonstrate it. And then there's a commitment or a transaction, and then the usage of that product or service, adoption of it into a lifestyle, and then, of course, returning to buy more or evangelizing the product or brand and back right around again to discovery. So in our teaching, we typically segment our platforms across a subscribe, win, and grow segmentation across this engagement journey. Subscribe is our effort to build audiences through trust, engage them, and ultimately evolve that initial trust with an audience that doesn't know who we are or perhaps doesn't believe in what we have to say yet. Then there is win. This is about evolving the initial trust we may have developed at the top of the customer engagement journey and deepening it to the point of them either raising their hand or coming to the self-conclusion that our brand or product may be the best for their particular need or want. We are winning their commitment at some level. And then there's the grow idea, where we are deepening the relationship with an existing customer or engaged audience member and adding experiences to deliver to our customers in an effort to create differentiation, loyalty, evangelism, etc. We are teaching customers to be better customers and thus growing our relationship with them. So typically, and again, there are exceptions to this, our efforts with content and how much brand to use can be aligned with this journey. The further to the left, or the top of the engagement journey, the more likely we are to want to create content as brand. Then the further to the right, the more likely we are to want to create something that is brand as content. So as you can see, when we add all of these elements together, we get a bit of a grid that can help us pinpoint what kind of content we might want to create and the best practices for doing so. So let's look at some of the examples to put this into context. We start with a subscribe experience in content marketing, lower left-hand side, and we can see what Arrow Electronics is doing with their recent acquisition spree. They now own 53 magazines, journals, and websites devoted to electrical engineers. They look at this as a separate business strategy, and for them, it's all about owning their audience and the relationship there, and the publications are a means of creating addressable audiences and keeping them viable for discovering new kinds of things, new kinds of opportunities to create electrical products. And of course, that's exactly what they sell. Moving to the right, we might see something like Monster's Career Advice Center, an amazing and of course more branded publication that is now 20% of all of their organic traffic. They use this separate publication attached to their website to drive more and more high-level subscriptions to their platform, and by recent estimates, they've shown that they can create the equivalent of $3 million in advertising by converting as much organic traffic as they have. And finally, all the way to the right is, of course, Salesforce Dreamforce that I mentioned earlier, and I've talked about what a great example it was of a grow experience where we're growing the relationship with that customer. So now let's quickly look at branded content. Moving up into branded content on the very left-hand side, we might see something like Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. This is a wonderful series starring Jerry Seinfeld and distributed through Netflix. The series started as a branded content effort with Acura, the car maker, and each car would be featured in a different episode. And for then the subsequent seasons of it, Lavazza Coffee took over, and it's a branded content effort for them. You only see a fleeting glimpse of Lavazza Coffee being made in each episode, and of course the whole thing is a content brand itself. Moving to the middle, we might see something like the partnership between Wall Street Journal and Chase Bank's credit card. They take audiences on a 360-degree virtual reality tour of 3 different cities and their quote-unquote must-see neighborhoods. The call to action on each place you explore in virtual reality? Well, it's how you can explore better with Ritz-Carlton Chase Rewards credit card. It is a direct call to action to win an application for a credit card using a branded content experience as the method of doing that. Then moving further to the right, maybe the quintessential branded content of our time, the Lego Movie. And the reason I put it into the grow category is because this movie isn't about introducing Lego to a new audience. It's about creating passion and a partnership between kids who love Lego and parents who love Lego. It is truly about giving parents and children a reason to love Lego together, growing trust with an existing audience. Now, finally, we can look at native advertising. On the far left, we have one of my favorite native ad campaigns of all time, and this comes from the Australian Tourist Board. It was a fake trailer for a movie about Crocodile Dundee, a sequel, if you will, which of course was also their Super Bowl ad. And the full 6-minute trailer, branded advertising, native advertising, featuring Chris Hemsworth, Hugh Jackman, and Danny McBride, well, it's a movie that quite honestly could have probably actually been made. And then in the middle, we have the Orange is the New Black native ad that won so many awards and was a partnership between HBO and the New York Times, helping to drive new viewers to the then very new and nascent show. Then over on the right, of course, we have something like KPMG's campaign, The Great Rewrite, in partnership with Forbes Brand Voice. Now, here's a wonderful integrated set of content being presented, thought leadership, but all of it, or at least much of it, by KPMG professionals themselves. There's never any doubt that this is KPMG bringing you this thought leadership, and the native ad is positioned as such. So there you have it. 9 different examples across 9 different sets of strategic content approaches, all of them created by innovative marketing teams who are using great content through leadership storytelling, through different uses and presence of their brand, and through different kinds of distribution methods. And I hope this has been somewhat helpful. Of course, we'll continue to evolve this as well as new terms, new approaches, and new best practices will change this as it needs to be changed. For now, this is our strategic content spectrum, and hopefully it helps you by knowing your purpose and helping you better see where your content might fit on the spectrum and developing the right kind of content to help you achieve your goals and move your business forward. So if you have any questions, of course, let us know. But in the meantime, it's your story. Tell it well. Thanks so much for attending.